And welcome everybody. It's Liz, you've done a questionnaire already.
Yeah, just a short one.
Okay, brilliant.
But I'm going to keep it going while more people join because we're still expecting quite a lot of people.
Okay, super. So if you don't mind, I'll put a little presentation up and then just introduce Community Energy South and this session. But and this session is really about getting our heads around community energy solar farms. And we've got Jake Burnyeat, who is going to follow on from me. And Jake's one of the leading practitioners in the country, developing and supporting solar farms from communities for renewables. He's done amazing stuff. Solar farm, some of his projects not only are leading projects in the country, but they also create exceptional community benefit funds that are there for local communities to benefit from. And you'll hear all about that. And he's been a great support to a lot of community energy companies. And so thanks, Jake, for taking the time to come and talk. Really appreciate that. And also we've got Steve Halsey from UK Power Networks, who's one of the leading members of UKPN and has worked in connections for a long time. And Steve, I'm delighted that you've joined us. So thank you very much, Steve. And you know, like Jake, you're a great character and really important to the industry. So building that relationship with the DNOs and understanding, you know, the pitfalls of connections and how to work with you as an organization is becoming more and more important for us all to move forward towards net zero. And that includes your colleagues over in the other DNOs as well, and transition to DSO and everything else that the market is going to move towards. So thank you, Steve, also for taking time out to join us, as well as everybody else. I think we've got nearly 50 people joined, and I expect there will be more joining. So really exciting. So do use the chat box and connect as much as we can. And I suppose finally, before I go into the presentation, I just want to thank Liz Sleeper, who is our chairman of events and a purpose person at Community Energy South, and she does a lot of work in the background, bringing these events together and connecting people. So reach out to Liz if you've got any feedback or anything. Okay. So I'm gonna see if I can share my presentation, which is, yeah. Can you see that, Liz?
We can see your little slides on the side as well, Ollie.
There you go.
Great, thank you.
So just a little bit about Community Energy South. We started in 2013 when we mentored 12 community energy groups across Sussex. Those 12 groups now employ over 25 full-time people. They have around about 25 megawatts of projects, hundreds of renewables and community energy projects, and reach nearly 3,000 homes a year for supporting people in fuel poverty. And that's kind of based on the Community Energy South approach. So we're there as a regional support for the sector. We look to capacity build, and our team includes engagement people as well as community energy mentors. And we have a program called Pathways, where we're supporting local authorities to develop community energy strategies in line with their climate change strategies to support thriving networks of community energy. And I think that's really important. You know, we all want to try and help the way towards net zero, you know, focusing in on 2030, and we're always taken in these events by the amount of interest from communities. So we're there to support you. In the background, we've got Community Energy England and nearly 400 community energy groups across England who sort of follow a similar mantra and share information and business models. So we very much advocate this strategy. We stole it from Energy Alton, who are also about 10-year-old community energy company. They have a powering up strategy and a powering down strategy. And I think that's really important for the community energy sector at the moment. You know, powering up is building renewables of all sorts, and heat and electric vehicles, hydros and community solar farms. But there's also that part of trusted local service, which is powering down, you know, where we're giving energy advice to our communities and we're a trusted support. And a lot of the community energy groups that we mentor and support now have funded energy champions in their communities who are there for the long haul, because community energy solar farms are 25-year projects. You know, this is, you're building something that's a long-term neighbor for a long time. So that trusted powering down support is really important as well. So just a little bit on local area energy plans. There's a big movement at the moment. Energy systems catapult, government are pushing it, local authorities are pushing, you know, they're alongside their climate change strategies are also really starting to dive into local area energy plans. You know, what is the possible on the network? And I urge you as community energy groups and communities to engage with that process with your local authorities. And again, we can steer you that way, because if we can link up community energy networks with local area energy plans, then we've got a good chance to getting to those net zero targets, and communities play an important part in that. This is what community energy pathways kind of looks like. We're working with Surrey County Council, Essex County Council, Hampshire, and across South Downs National Park. But community energy pathways.
You're all right there, Ollie.
I'm just relocating because as like a lot of us, I'm at home and I have a busy family and they all just walked in the door. Community energy pathways, this is how local authorities see it. So it's a step-by-step approach to develop a community-wide community energy movement. This is Surrey County Council's view of the community energy sector. It's important to support communities to net zero, build innovation and renewable energy projects, but also that powering down element, the outreach and, you know, the energy advice. So I just wanted to make that point really. And this is down in Hampshire, where there are 5 or 6 community energy groups now really thriving and working together in unison with the county council. And that's important as well, just to stress that point. And we build partnerships and for the sector, and building these partnerships to help us. Now, there are partnerships at all level, on a community level, but also at a regional level. And we spend a lot of time in the team at Community Energy South building those partnerships for the sector, particularly I already explained with UKPN, but with the railways and the net zero hubs are a great resource as well. So if you need to know more information on that, do reach out. And then for what Liz does, it's very important that community energy pathways, you can link up in our newsletter, and we have these monthly webinars, third Thursday of every month, which you obviously know about because you're here. But so do let us know if you want a particular topic to talk about. Reach out to Liz and we'll put it on that list and can keep on doing what we do. I think that's probably enough for me from now on this. So just to set the scene on solar farms, how I see the market at the moment with community solar farms, and please, Jake and Steve, you know, correct me if not when your time comes. But what I'm hearing is that it's difficult to get onto the grid until 2030, nearly now. I'm also seeing a lot of movement, a lot of push from existing solar farm developers coming into communities and struggling with the planning process in some cases. and also with engagement with local parishes. And I see that as an opportunity for the community energy sector to align with community, with solar developers and talk to them about co-ownership and involvement, because you can make a significant difference to getting them through planning, good projects, with the community on side. And I think that
it sounds to me like we've lost. Oh, there you are.
There are my back, Liz.
Yes,
Can you not? Yeah. Okay. Good. And so that's an important element. But if you do have an area where you want to develop a solar farm, number one is to make sure you have a good option with the landowner in place. So landowner is in place.
Is anyone else unable to hear Ollie?
Number two is that
yeah, he is breaking up.
Ollie, I'm going to cut you short because you obviously don't have very good internet, and hand you over to Jake. Hand the speaking slot over to Jake. And Ollie, thank you, and thank you very much. And please put lots of comments and the rest of your comments in the chat box.
General comment, if I may, can people use Ethernet rather than Wi-Fi if they want to have a good connection? Thank you.
Thank you.
Morning all, has that come up, Liz?
Great, yep, we can see, yep, lovely.
Great, okay. So I am going to talk through at a fairly high level the steps to building a community solar farm, and I'll give you the summary at the outset that it is doable. And why would you do it? Because energy is a drain of something like £2,000 per head of population on any local economy. And communities can't build their own nuclear power stations or gas power stations, but they can generate their own power from wind and solar. And in doing that, they can help to localize that energy spend. So rather than being a drain on the local economy, some of that money is going round and round in the local economy and becomes a local economic multiplier. They can generate power for their community, and they can generate surplus income to help that community transition to net zero and tackle fuel poverty. So it is doable, and there's a good reason to do it. It has been done, but it's definitely not the norm. The policy environment in the UK mainly supports commercial development models, and the community-owned generation capacity that's out there is out there largely against the odds, and accounts for less than 0.5% of the UK's renewables. And the UK has made amazing progress over the last 20 years in going renewable. Nearly half our electricity comes from renewable sources now, but only 0.5% of that half our electricity is community owned. So we need to try and change that. But it is challenging. It's challenging for multiple reasons that I'll go through, and it takes a lot of work. So my company, Communities Renewables, or CFR, we're a not-for-profit company, Cornwall, working across England at the moment. We've been going since 2012, and we help communities, councils, and not-for-profits to set up their own renewable energy enterprises, and we work with them to develop, finance, and manage their own generation. We've helped to develop and finance community solar projects with a capital value of about 60 million. And we provide ongoing company and asset management services to 50 megawatts of community solar across 7 localities. And that 50 megawatts of solar is projected to generate something like £20 million of surplus income over their operational lifetimes to support net zero transition and community projects in their localities. And the last solar farms we've built were back in 2016, but we're now working on a number of new community solar farms under a subsidy-free model, ranging from quite small scale 1 to 2 megawatt village solar farms up to larger schemes. So what makes a community solar farm community owned rather than commercially owned? What's the difference? The key thing for us is that the solar farm is owned by a not-for-profit company that's set up to serve the local community, that has its community purpose locked into its articles of association, and it's governed by local volunteer directors. So its whole purpose is different. Whereas a commercial solar farm is owned by a commercial developer or solar fund or infrastructure fund, and it's set up to generate returns for that fund. To build a solar farm, you need to raise money. And when we're raising money for a large scale solar farm, typically we're raising it from multiple sources: a long-term bank loan, an element of community investment through shares or bonds, and sometimes we need a bridge loan to fill the gap in between. And that community investment is of local benefit to the extent that the investors are local, because it keeps some of the cost of finance in the local community. But primarily it's a means to an end of raising that capital to build the solar farm to generate surplus income for the local community. And the key thing about that investment is that if the solar farm makes more money, those investors don't get a higher return. Their return is fixed, and any surplus income goes to the community purpose. Whereas a commercial solar farm, some solar farms will pay a community benefit fund, but it'll be an amount set each year, maybe a few £100 a megawatt, that goes to normally the parish council to support their project. So it's kind of operating cost for the solar farm rather than its sole purpose. In terms of the electricity, at the moment, it's more or less the same. Both a commercial solar farm and a community solar farm supplies power into the grid, and they'll sell that power to a power company that will sell it on to consumers across the country. What we need to see is a model where communities generate their own power, can sell it to local consumers at a reduced or long-term fixed cost. But so far, that's not happened. I think it will happen in the next couple of years, driven by the energy crisis. And then a commercial and a community solar farm will pay a rent to the landowner, and it will pay business rates to the local council. What might that look like in practice? Typically, the solar farm is owned by a special purpose company that's a wholly owned subsidiary of a community cooperative. The bank loan is directly to the solar farm special purpose company, as are all the operations contracts. The community investment is raised at the community cooperative level. The governance is at community cooperative level. And with a large scale project, they do need to be professionally managed. So you'll have a company and asset management contractor like CFR or Energy for All, or there's other companies in the UK that will do it, that'll look after those companies and the solar farm for the community. And the role of the directors is to govern its direction, make key decisions, and decide how the surplus funds are allocated. Some examples: one in the Community Energy South area is Ferry Farm Community Solar. That's just on the outskirts of Halsey. It's a 5 megawatt solar farm, 25 acres. It was built in 2016. It was initially developed by the landowner and a commercial developer, and we managed to raise the funds to buy it back into the full ownership of the community cooperative. It's funded now by a combination of a long-term bank loan from Triodos Bank and 1.1 million in community shares and bonds. And it's expected to generate something over £2 million of surplus income over its lifetime to support community projects and net zero transition schemes in the very local community of Halsey and Sidlesham. It's allocated over 250,000 to date to local projects and played a key role in the community's COVID crisis, funding laptops for children that didn't have them at home so they could carry on home learning, funded the COVID response network, food distribution, a number of key things that kept that community going through the COVID crisis. And now it's turning its focus to the longer term challenge of how they deal with the net zero transition. And in their case, they're right on the coast, vulnerable coast, how they deal with the future impacts of climate change. Second example is a larger scheme up in North Somerset, Burnham and Western Energy, who own a 9.3 megawatt solar farm on agricultural land between Weston-super-Mare and Burnham-on-Sea. Again, it was initially developed by a commercial developer. acquired into community ownership, ultimately financed by a long-term bank loan, again from Triodos Bank, and £4 million raised through a community bond offer, which is the largest community solar bond offer done in the UK to date. And some new projects we're working on. This is a landfill site on the outskirts of Plymouth. It's owned by Plymouth City Council, and it's a 13 megawatt scheme being developed as a joint venture between Plymouth Energy Community. It's a very well established community energy cooperative in the city and the City Council, and it secured planning consent last week, and we're now looking for construction contractors to build it. The other end of the scale, a kind of village scale solar farm being developed by Bath and West Community Energy in Somerset. It's a 1 to 2 megawatt project set up to serve the neighbouring village of Compton Dando. And it's a field owned by a local farmer. About half the field will be taken up with solar panels, and the idea is the other half of the field will be put over to a community orchard and nature reserve. So the benefits are wider than the solar farm. That opens up a new community and nature space for the village. So key components of a viable solar project are an appropriate piece of land and an engaged landowner and a landowner agreement ultimately. A viable grid connection agreement. That's the big challenge at the moment. A team to deliver it and the finance to cover the risk investment. Planning consent, someone willing to purchase the power, ideally under a long-term fixed price contract. A contractor willing to build it, the finance needed to build it, and then an ongoing team that can look after it. So those are all the pieces of the jigsaw. Site requirements, key thing is grid, and hopefully Steve does come on and he can talk through some of the challenges there. If not, I can whittle on about it. That is the big constraint on any new renewable energy project at the moment, is we're hitting the limit of the amount of variable generation capacity that the current grid can take, and that makes it incredibly difficult to find a site. And there's very intense competition from commercial developers to find sites that correspond to viable grid capacity. You need a willing landowner. In terms of land area, commercial developers are generally focusing on very large schemes, 50 megawatts, and a 50 megawatt solar farm could take 200 acres of land. So they're huge schemes. At the kind of bottom end of what commercial solar developers are looking at is probably 20 megawatts, 50 acres or so, 60 or 70 acres. The Compton Dando project that I put up before, 1 to 2 megawatt scheme, is 5 to up to 10 acres, so a medium-sized field. But those smaller schemes, commercial developers are not interested in, because they only work under a community ownership model. Ideally, the site would be well screened, flat or well screened land, surrounded by high hedges to reduce its visual impact. Land grade, ideally 3B or lower, and can meet key planning considerations, which for solar are ecology, landscape, cultural heritage, neighbour impacts, flooding, access, etc. Key stages in developing a solar farm are feasibility. Probably the quickest you can do that in 3 months, but if there's challenges, it can take a lot longer. And that's finding the sites, engaging the landowner, securing a grid connection, doing basic planning feasibility work, and submitting a pre-application. And the cost for that is something of the region of 10 to 40,000. Development, so getting to the stage where the land option is signed, the grid offer has been accepted, all the environmental studies have been carried out and a planning application submitted, community engaged, and the power purchase and finance strategy sorted. 6 to 12 months, could be longer, could be 2 to 3 years, and a cost of 100 to 200,000 pounds plus. And the key thing here is that feasibility and development spend is risk investment. If the project doesn't secure planning consent, it falls over for some other reason, that money is lost. So that is the hardest chunk of money to find. Then you come to pre-construction and finance. So raising the construction finance to build it, pre-construction surveys, procuring the construction contractors, and finalizing the power purchase agreements. 6 months in normal times at the moment. Lead times are pushing everything out. It's probably 12 months, and another 1 to 200,000 of still lower risk investment, but still risk investment, because if the transaction falls over, that money could be lost. And that 1 to 200,000 is grid deposits, legal fees involved in the construction contractor work, and financing and project management fees. And then you come to build it, and they're reasonably quick to build, 3 months, kind of normal time for building a solar farm. And then the operational life, 30 years. In terms of the build costs, 2 megawatt scheme, perhaps 1.5 to 2 million, 13 megawatt scheme, 8 to 12 million. A few years ago, we had very high certainty on build costs. Now, because of the inflationary pressures on everything, supply chain issues, it is very hard to pin down a build cost. And build costs have increased for the sorts of projects we're working on, I think probably around 1.5 times, i.e. 50% more expensive to build a solar farm now than it was 3 years ago. So considerations, there's a lot of competition for sites. You're up against well-funded, well-resourced, experienced commercial developers, and that competition is primarily for grid capacity. The grid is getting increasingly constrained, not just at distribution level, but also at transmission level. So that the shift to subsidy-free has meant developers are looking for much larger schemes, and they're schemes that are too big to connect at the distribution network, the 11 and 33,000 volt network. They're going directly into the 132,000 volt transmission network. And so now we have the grid being squeezed from two directions, the accumulation of projects connecting at distribution level, but also from the top down with very large solar and battery schemes connecting directly at transmission level. And there is a significant challenge in the way that the grid queuing system works, that if you are a community scale project connecting at 11,000 volts or 33,000 volts, you have to first go through the distribution application process and secure a connection, pay potentially a significant deposit to secure that connection. And only after you've accepted that connection, the distribution network operator, UKPN or Western Power or SSEN, submits something called a statement of works to National Grid. The National Grid will come back 90 days later and tell you whether there is a problem at National Grid level. And the answer now across most areas is there is a problem at National Grid level, and the upgrades required to accommodate these projects is pushing back connection times to 2028. And so that's a challenge of transmission grid capacity that wasn't there before, but because the process is in 2 stages, you can effectively get gazumped. If you've secured connection at distribution level and a big solar farm comes in at transmission level after you've accepted your offer, but before National Grid will come back to you, they can effectively take your space in the grid. The risk investment is a challenge, and for the last few years, we've had the benefit of a very good government grant fund called the Rural Community Energy Fund that provides up to 40,000 of feasibility funding and then a further 100,000 of risk investment to get it through the planning process. And that fund has now come to an end, and they haven't yet announced a replacement, although communities do seem to be succeeding in finding grants from other sources. It takes a long time. It's a huge amount of work. It really does need some professional support to do it. It's too much to ask volunteers to manage. And some sites can divide the community. It's rare to find a solar farm site or wind farm site where everyone in the community will be happy with it. That's it, Liz. Liz, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, thank you, Jake. That was really interesting. Very, very interesting presentation. Actually, I've got lots of questions. And also, I just want to point out, we've got 2 people here from the, what's it called now? The Energy Hub. No, you're called the Net Zero Hub now, but formerly RCEF. We've got John Taylor and is it Paul Kemp? They're both here too. So do please, you know, John and Paul, if you've got anything you'd like to say, do please add it. while I look for Steve. Steve, are you here, Steve Halsey? You are, great.
Yes, yeah.
Great. Well, why don't you get ready to share your presentation? And there's lots of questions coming up in the chat box that look like very meaty questions. So we'll get onto those after your presentation, Steve, and you can unmute yourself and maybe respond to some of Jake's comments, which I thought were really interesting. And while we wait, I just have to say, last year we did a session on community farms, on community ownership of solar farms, and we had Low Carbon along, who are a large developer, who were keen to work with local communities. And my main learning from that is make sure you've got a community group with a bank account up and running before any large developers come in, because once they come in and want to get a project going, if they are open for working with communities, you need to be ready for them to work with you. So make sure you've got a group with a bank account. Jake, do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, there is a slide on that I've put as further info on my presentation. So if you download the presentation afterwards, there's some pointers there.
Brilliant, thank you. So over to you, Steve.
Okay, am I off mute?
Yep, we can hear you.
Fabulous. I am struggling to share my screen at this end, and
okay.
are you able to run the slides from your end, please?
Oh, I'm really bad at that.
Right. Hang about.
Okay. Well, while you do that, while you work with that, Nicola, you're here. Are there any questions? You've been keeping an eye on the questions. Are there any questions that Jake could answer while we wait for Steve? Okay, I'm going to hand over to Norwich.
Steve, do you want to email Ollie Pendred your Liz? Could Steve email me the presentation?
Yep, thank you. Or put it in the chat box and you can download it. And while you and Steve sort that out, I'm going to hand over. Norwich Community Solar have questions on grid capacity, which Jake may be able to answer.
Yes, I'll work up to the bottom. So the question is, as constraints on grid capacity rise, both at transmission and distribution levels, until we sort this, space will be mopped up by commercial developers. Just lost the question, sorry.
Okay, well, it's fine because Steve's ready.
Okay, we'll come back to that. It's a good question. And there's a bunch of good questions in there. We'll come back to them.
Okay, so hopefully you can see the slide presentation. I've got something very strange going on at my end, so bear with me. Yes, this has been a long-standing meeting in my calendar, and I'm glad to be here, and thank you for your kind words at the beginning, Ollie. So interestingly, I am actually here today at a building in London, presenting also immediately after this session on a subject of connecting projects to the grid. And here in the room with me, although I've now come out of that meeting room, are National Grid also, and two people from National Grid that I know fairly well. And as Jake pointed out, there are some real challenges out at the moment, and I'll try to sort of touch on those. I've put together a fairly sort of brief presentation, and I'm aiming to sort of speak around those and try and pick up on some of the points that have been raised. So the agenda, the bits I'm going to cover really is who we are and where we are and what we do. And if you're not familiar with who UK Power Networks are, then I'll tell you about that. Just touch on the changing energy world, which I'm sure we all know about, but it's useful just to sort of mention where we're at, and then touch on engaging with the distribution network operator. Applying for a connection, things to do and to consider, so to touch on some of the things that Jake has already mentioned, and some other things to think about that perhaps may not be immediately obvious to you. So UK Power Networks, who are we? We are the distribution network operator, the DNO that owns, operates and maintains the electricity distribution network in the whole of the southeast of the country. For the older members of the audience, that is London Electricity Board, Eastern Electricity Board and Seaboard. And we cover a good proportion of the population. 28% of the total population of the UK. And already we have 9.3 gigawatts worth of distributed generation connected to our networks. And pretty well just over half of that is actually renewable generation, largely in the form of solar and wind, of course. And all of that is against the backdrop of a peak demand for our area. Well, certainly pre-COVID, a peak demand of something like 16 gigawatts. So if it was both sunny and windy all of the time, then we could probably meet just about a quarter of our needs for that peak demand from renewable generation. So the changing energy world, I mean, we all know about this, but I just think it's useful to touch on it. The old world was large scale, predominantly coal and oil fired power stations in the north of England, sending electricity through the transmission network to local distribution companies, the electricity boards that they were through, and through to the customer. And of course, what we're seeing now is a much more diverse type of network, where we have wind farms, solar farms connected to DNOs at local level rather than to the transmission level, community energy schemes, electric vehicle charging hubs, all of those things are now connecting to the network, and at various times of the day are either inputting to the network, exporting from their facility, or importing. And the newer technology is really battery storage, and there are good opportunities, and certainly commercial developers, again, that sort of Jake referred to, are looking to exploit certainly existing connections that they already have by looking to install battery storage to give their existing installation perhaps some slightly wider shoulders and a larger operating profile. But also many of the applications that we're receiving today from predominantly commercial developers are for dual fuel or bivalent installations, typically solar farm with batteries added on. And gone are the days of sort of those smaller 5 megawatt, 10 megawatt connections. We're much more seeing 50 megawatts, 60 megawatts, 70 megawatt, even up to 100 megawatt connections. And some of those large connections are actually still being made onto the distribution network rather than just to the transmission network. So lots more interaction between all of those people connected to the network, whether they're importing or exporting. That's the current world we're in, and that's very challenging for all of the DNOs. So let me move on. I think what I would say from the outset is where a good starting point are DNO websites, and each of the large the 6 DNO companies, their websites are here, and that was pretty well just a screenshot I took from the front page of every DNO there, and pretty well you can see quite quickly that you could get to connections or something relating to getting connected on each of those websites. And there was a good source of information on each of those websites, and I'll show you one of those on the next slide. So given that some of the timescales now are looking, as Jake mentioned, and quite rightly, out to 2028, 2030, 2031 in some instances, and certainly they're the numbers, or they're the years that I'll be mentioning in the presentation that I do after this one. That can conflict with getting planning permission, because planning permission obviously is only valid for 3 years, I believe. And what we're starting to see now from developers is, well, look, if I can't get my grid connection until 2028, and yet a key part of that is having planning permission to build the site, I need to make sure that I do that in a timely fashion. So what I would say is check out the DNO websites. A whole range of information on there, and certainly the opportunity to engage with connections project managers, connections designers, interact with information that's available on there, and in some instances DNOs and certainly we ourselves will offer a surgery session, whereby particularly if you're in that in the early days of the project and you haven't got any of those professional people on board that perhaps Jake spoke about, then a good place is to have a surgery session with the DNO to understand what is possible and what's not possible. And whilst again, as Jake mentioned, some of the commercial developers are gobbling up some of that capacity. They're not interested in the smaller sites, the 1 or 2 megawatts or 3 megawatts that might be more viable for community energy schemes. So one of the probably the most useful resources is something called heat maps, and there's 2 examples here. UK Power Networks version is in the middle, and I think that is Scottish and Southerns, isn't it, from the area? That's Scottish and Southerns. And again, these give an indication of available capacity, either on an area basis, at a substation level, and in some instances give an indication of the volume of traffic that DNOs are receiving in terms of the numbering. Excuse me, in terms of the number of inquiries that they are receiving. And all DNOs are receiving an unprecedented level of inquiries, not just for grid scale connections, but for the connection of all low carbon technologies, solar panels on roofs, of course, with the current price of energy, people looking to buy electric vehicles and have electric vehicle connections, and all of those are having an impact, certainly at distribution level, and in some instances a knock-on impact on the transmission network. So just some things, some bullet points there. I think the thing there to do is to apply it early, but make sure you've done your homework. So all of those things that Jake mentioned, absolutely try to do as much of that as you can. And when you are then ready to make a viable connection application to the DNO, then make that application. But book a surgery session before you do that. If you just want to have a sort of a ballpark discussion, what the whys and the wherefores of doing that, then all DNOs will offer you that, and offer a useful resource for certainly the uninitiated, let's say, or those early stages of a project. Consider appointing a consultant and at the appropriate stage. And again, I mean, Jake outlined where the costs are incurred, and you may not want to do that too early. But a key part of making a successful application is the completion of an application form, and the G99 application form for projects that are larger than 50 kilowatts is quite a lengthy document, and even the guide to how to connect is even lengthier. So the guide there, engineering recommendation G99, that document runs to 364 pages and contains lots and lots and lots of very, very technical information. And in order to complete the application form, on the right there, which runs to about 50 pages, still requires some level of technical understanding to be able to do that. And the DNO will only be able to process your application if you have provided a certain level of minimum information about the technology you're looking to build as part of your community energy project. Some things to think about is traditionally, people have applied to DNOs, and we're all familiar with sort of a 24/7 365 connection, that unconstrained connection. It's always there, always available, always on, and that's traditionally, as I said, what we've had, and what most connections have been for the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years or so. With that push on available capacity now, those unconstrained connections are becoming more costly, and they are taking longer to deliver and longer to procure. But they may not always be what is absolutely needed. And a controlled, I put in there in inverted commas the word phrase, controlled, and that's I think mentioned an A&M type connection could be a possibility, active network management, and where the connection is constrained or curtailed in some way, shape or form. Now that could be, for example, that if you had a storage device that you didn't import, or the curtailment on that storage device was such that you couldn't import to charge that device during the hours of 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. when the demand on the network is already at its highest. That's probably the easiest example to understand. And some form of controlled, curtailed, constrained connection could be cheaper to install, and certainly is likely to be delivered more quickly. And I've mentioned storage a couple of times. Multiple technologies may provide more flexibility on a site, and whilst storage can increase the costs, of course, if you do have storage, you may well be at times when you're not able to export. If you've got a constrained connection, for example, then you could well charge that battery and then use the charge from that battery at other times of the day. So I think that's all the slides I had, and I wanted to keep it reasonably high level, and happy to sort of take any questions if people have got any questions. But it's very, very difficult at the moment. I recognise that, and certainly National Grid recognise that. And as I say, I'm here and presenting 5 to 12 to a wider group on trying to find a way through some of those challenges that certainly commercial developers and community energy developers are currently finding. So Liz, back to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I thought that was really helpful and helping clarify things. I've picked out a few questions that they're completely different. They're just completely different. So can I suggest that Juliet O'Brien, you have a question? So can you unmute, and Jeanette, can you unmute yourself so you're ready to ask the following question?
Sorry, Steve, can you just unshare your screen so everyone can see each other?
Unshare, yep, sorry.
Thanks, Jake.
Stop share. There we go.
Hi, yeah, my question was, you've been talking about the difficulty of connection to the grid, but is there a way to bypass the grid, and or will there be a way in the future, and just supply homes, you know, the local community directly?
I mean, there's a push for sort of localized energy at the moment, and I mean, we hear the phrase off grid, without a doubt. That is absolutely possible, and there's no reason why a sort of off-grid, a totally off-grid community couldn't exist. I think my gut feel is people would still like that surety, that certainty of being connected to a reliable connection at some point in time. But there is absolutely no reason why something couldn't be a fully connection to the grid in itself. But
not at the moment.
Well, I'm not aware of any of those types of developments happening at the current time, but it's probably in its infancy, I guess, that type of arrangement.
Okay, thank you.
Jake, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, the grid is a pretty good thing to have. In terms of balancing supply and demand and bringing in different renewable sources from different parts of the country, and topping up the system with storage and gas where needed. The amount of generation capacity and storage capacity you'd need to be completely off grid would probably make it technically unviable. And the very fact that communities are thinking about that shows what dire straits that we're in terms of the grid situation. But what I do think we need is a cleverer way of managing generation and consumption and balancing it at local level. And the system is going slowly that way, but it needs to go faster that level. It needs to go quicker that way. There's a couple of other questions related to batteries and local supply, and I think they're all interrelated. So someone said, is a battery an answer to grid problems? It should be. It should be that if you're a community managing generation and consumption within your area of the network, that a battery could play a role in that. But at the moment, the distribution network operators and National Grid just see batteries as generators. They're not recognizing the role of batteries in soaking up surplus generation and supplying demand when there's a shortage of supply. So that's got to change, and we need a market and technical infrastructure that can reward that at distribution level.
Thank you. Juliet, do you feel your question's been answered by John? Just give me a thumbs up, because if so, I'll pass on to Roger Davies.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
So Norwich, I see you're there. I'm just going to hand over to Roger Davies first, if I may.
Hi, thank you. It's a fairly simple question, I think. We're at sort of early stage of exploring what sort of options may be available to us. And from looking on our local distribution website, which is Scottish and Southern, what seems to be our local substation is described as being constrained. Now, constraint's been used in different contexts in the talk, and I just wonder whether the constrained in the context of the substation means that they don't have enough power and so would welcome input, or does it mean something different?
Yeah, I do get that the word constrained could be used in a slightly different context. I would imagine, exactly as you've described there, Roger, that constrained doesn't mean that it will only welcome constrained connections. It's probably indicating that there are that substation is at very near capacity and hasn't got the ability to provide any additional capacity for any new connections. I think that's exactly what is meant by that. And I mean, the idea of sort of exporting from a community energy scheme to an individual, a small substation, a substation that might be at the end of the road. Now that's typically only a one MVA substation, quite a small. Certainly in London, they could be as small as 315 kVA out in the sticks. And if you've got a pole-mounted transformer at the end of an overhead line, then that could be as little as a 15 kVA substation, a transformer. So and what needs to be fundamentally sort of understood, and I don't mean in any sort of condescending way, of course, is that the network that was originally built was for the electricity to flow in one direction, and that was from the big stuff to the little stuff, the consumer. And the network is now being asked to push electricity in both directions. And some of the pieces of equipment that are out there are not designed for what is called reverse power flow. So whilst it might seem, yes, if it is a constrained and it could do with some extra help from a community energy scheme, it may not be that simple at first sight, of course. And there's the upstream network. You might well be able to export to that substation, but the upstream network might not have the capacity to absorb any export anyway. So it's quite a complex jigsaw, let's say.
Okay, and that's presumably something, if we went and talked to SS&E and one of their surgery type things that you've described, they'd be able to sort of straighten it out and give us some details about.
They should be able to do that, Roger. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, Norwich Community Solar, but just before you ask a question, I can see in the chat that some of our questions are going towards the policy, issues about policy, and I'm completely signed up to we need to change policies, but this particular session is really about practical help. And so put all your policy requirements in the chat, but let's just use this for getting really practical advice for people that want to create projects at the moment within the policy constraints that exist, if that's okay. Norwich.
Thanks, Liz. Just wanted to come back on, I think it was Juliet O'Brien's question about how to avoid using the network. There are plenty of examples of projects that are somewhere in between completely off grid and remaining connected to the grid. And it seems to me that given the constraint issues that we are facing, which arguably could have been foreseen and dealt with 10 years ago, but haven't been, we should be considering a completely pure distributed energy system, which is what renewable energy lends itself to. And that is to say that we should be using the generated energy close to or near as possible to the site of generation. And this is possible and does exist already in situations where the load, maybe it's a pumping station for the water company or a housing development or a large battery, are already connected to the grid, and the distributed energy generator, the solar farm or whatever, tops up the import requirements so that it reduces the demand on the grid and in fact helps the grid out. So it is possible to have this middle way, which hasn't actually been mentioned, between completely off-grid and fully connected, grid-connected generator, for the generator actually to be connected to the load, but the load to remain connected to the grid. And in that way, you don't have these problems necessarily with the constraint. In fact, you benefit the grid by supporting the load's requirements and taking the requirement off the grid to supply it. So I think that would lend itself more to this distributed energy model that we've always been talking about for about 20 years, but the network companies don't seem to have caught up. Thank you.
Thank you, Norwich, because I can't remember your name.
Nigel.
No, thank you, Nigel. Jake and Steve and Ollie, do any of you want to comment on that?
I can give an example of a project like that. There is a new community housing scheme being built in Totnes in Devon by a community land trust, some 50 units, and their local community energy enterprise, which is called Tressoc, will be putting solar on the roofs of all those houses and operating the solar through a microgrid within the estate. So that if number 10 are out, but their roof is generating, number 11 can use the power, and that means collectively there is a higher utilization of the solar generated on a kind of real-time basis. But the reason that is, it's not easy, but the reason it's relatively easy to implement is it's in a new build, it's an estate. So what normally would happen when you build an estate like that is the developer puts in the electrical infrastructure and then the local network operator will adopt it. But in this case, rather than the local network operator adopting it, Tressoc is going to retain ownership of the electrical infrastructure and use it to operate the microgrid, and they'll essentially have a supply point on the where the grid comes into the estate, where they can buy and sell top up or surplus power. I think it's much harder to implement retrofit across a network which is already owned and operated by the distribution network operator, and there isn't the kind of captive community to put into it in one go.
Thank you, Jake. Ollie, I need to hand over to you because the doorbell's going. So Ollie, could you please chair for a moment? And Stuart, over to you.
Thank you. Actually, I think Jake answered my question as well around the microgrid, because that does seem to be a good option, and particularly where we are in Essex, there's a lot of house building going on. Part of my question was, can the planning system force developers to do that, or is that an option? Do we have to go in and convince a developer that there is another option, or what is the planning situation? Does that help us in those regards? Because it must be in the benefit of the grid as well.
I think if the planning system, we've gone backwards on this in recent years, but if the planning system set very high requirements for low carbon and on-site generation for new property developments, whether that's housing or commercial mixed use, then the developers would look at their options for doing it. And at the moment they can, the standards aren't particularly challenging, to be honest, and they can do quite a lot of it through allowable solutions, through off-site generation or making a payment to someone else to deal with that elsewhere. If they had to do it on site but didn't want to fund the generation themselves, then that would open up the option for the local community energy enterprise and come in and say, right, we'll do this. And maybe to have a mixed model where you've got a new housing estate being built, the developer says, we can't add on £10,000 for renewables to the cost of housing because no one will pay for it. But you could leave that choice to the house buyer. The house buyer comes in and they're willing and able to put 10k more on their mortgage to own the stuff themselves. They can do that. But if they can't do that, then their fallback option is the community energy enterprise puts the solar panels and other infrastructure on and recovers the cost through some kind of energy services agreement.
Yeah. We have a neighbourhood plan that's just been launched in Danbury in Essex, and it's 100 houses to be built. It seems such a good opportunity to maybe force that sort of high renewables and also, minimise grid loading and everything else onto that agenda before it's adopted. So it's kind of my thought. Just one quick other question. Is there any examples of a street taking back its network?
Not that I'm aware of in the UK, has been done in Germany.
I know it's been done in Germany and they've celebrated that, a whole town, I think. Is there any constraint to that other than reluctance on the grid to give up its assets?
It's a question for Steve, not me.
Yeah, that was directed at Steve. Sorry, Joe.
I mean, we talk about the grid and DNOs. There are such things as IDNOs, independent distribution network operators, who are not geographically constrained in the same way that DNOs are, and that could essentially be the nearest you're going to get to that at the current time. So that is an organisation that sets up an independent network, typically for a new housing estate. Again, not generally applied retrospectively, and there are many examples of independent network operators owning and operating a network for a discrete housing estate, let's say. But that's probably as far as, to my knowledge, that's as close as we've got to that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Before I hand over to Ollie, who's got lots of questions, I'm noticing that the people who've raised their hands with questions are all very experienced people. And I really, you know, this is an inclusive event. Community Energy is very inclusive. So please, whoever you are, if you don't know what we're talking about, please ask questions, you know, even if it's what's the difference between PV and solar thermal. Every question is acceptable. I'm handing over to you now, Ollie.
Well, yeah, hopefully you can hear me because I'm a bit nearer to my router. Can you hear me, Liz?
Yes, we can.
Great. Yeah, it was just, we're looking at a project at the moment called Communiheat, which is very much in the innovation space, where we've worked with the DNO to model a rural parish and all the LV substations within the parish, so that we can understand the capacity levels within those substations. And the vision kind of is to connect multiple, say 10 to 20 small scale 200 kilowatt schemes around the village that would then make up to a larger scheme, because then we know the capacity of the LV substations within a village. So I just wanted to put that on the table, really, you know, for those of you in parishes. But the Communiheat project is also looking at the innovation around flexibility markets and network balancing and things like that. And also I'm seeing SSEN coming out with a new model with Centre for Sustainable Energy on flexibility, you know, where homes can flex, can power down through that point. But anyway, that's moving away from solar farms. The other question that I had, which I think I put on the chat, was kind of directed at Jake about how should the community energy sector work with developers that maybe have grid connection but are going through planning, and what does a good relationship with a developer look like for a community energy organization? Is there an opportunity there? Does that make sense?
I think there is an opportunity, and a lot of the larger scale community owned solar farms that are up and running were initially developed by commercial developers and then acquired into community ownership. For it to work, there has to be a recognized mutual benefit model, I'll put it that way. And I think how can a developer benefit a community? They've got the land, they've got the grid, they've got that hundreds of thousands of risk investment to get the project through the planning process. How can the community benefit the developer? They can help engage the community if they have a secure option to buy that solar farm into community ownership. They can explain that to the community. They can explain the benefits, so they can try and build a positive story around the project. That's number one, and that's, you know, probably the main reason why a developer would want to work with the community, is they would see a local community energy enterprise support them through planning as a benefit, so help them get consent. Having said that, that comes with a big caveat. If you've got a commercial developer with a controversial project that is already bogged down in with an opposition group, adding community ownership to that isn't going to help. In fact, it's probably going to make it worse, because the community will just look at that and go, "You're just trying to sweeten the pill." So for that model to work, the site has to be good. It shouldn't just be, commercial developers need to look at that model for good sites, not just the ones that they see are a real challenge. And the partnership needs to be agreed right at the beginning before the project goes public, so it's an integral part of that project right from the outset, and not seen as something that's retrofitted to it to try and sweeten the pill and overcome opposition. The other ways a community can benefit a commercial developer is securing a long-term power purchase partner. So your local council, I hope, would rather buy their electricity from a local community-owned project, which is delivering lots of benefit, than a commercially owned scheme, which is probably going to change ownership 2 or 3 times in its lifetime. So you potentially have a route to the economic viability of that project if you can get your local authority, hospitals, other public sector bodies, businesses on side as wanting to buy the power from you if you own it. And you are a route to the developer getting their money. So most developers, not all, most developers will sell their projects either pre or post construction. And a solar farm typically gets sold 2 or 3 times in its life. It will start off with a entrepreneurial prospecting developer that will find the site, get the planning consent, get the grid connection and land agreements. They'll then sell those bits of paper to a solar construction company for a profit. Solar construction company will build them and then probably sell them on in blocks of maybe 100 megawatts to a solar fund or a pension fund post construction, or after 3 years once they got some income out of it. So most developers are looking to sell a project to someone. They could agree to sell it to a community rather than a solar fund, but the challenge is the market is so overheated that there's too much money chasing too few sites, that the prices being paid on the open market for those solar farms are probably too high to be viable for a community. So the other key part of the deal at the beginning is if the community's agreeing to support that project through the process and help get consent where consent might otherwise not be granted, and help secure a local PPA, power purchase agreement, where that might not be available to the commercial developer, that has to be recognized in the price mechanism of how much that community is going to pay for buying the project from the commercial developer. And the commercial developer will still make a very decent profit out of that, but they could probably make a higher profit if they'd sold it to a solar infrastructure fund.
Thank you, Jake. John Taylor, did you have questions or comments to make? And then I'm going to I'll hand over to Rodney from MEPM.
Well, hi there, everyone. I was more commenting on some of the questions that were made earlier, just expanding on the answers. So I work for the Greater South East Net Zero Hub. We're a BASE-funded team that recently ran the Rural Community Energy Fund. So we're very much in that world of that feasibility and planning for community solar, and also work with local authorities on net zero delivery. So going forwards, we have the resource to continue to help community energy groups have those conversations with DNOs, especially what Jake was just saying about getting PPA agreements with local authorities. We're looking to provide that matchmaking role. We can definitely help with those conversations. We know there's demand for local authorities to do that. And on the planning question in particular, I've put the answers in the chat now, but neighbourhood plans and local plans are the ideal time to allocate sites for community solar farms and even wind, community-owned wind. So if you can get agreement at that stage, it makes it a lot easier to then develop the sites out later on. Okay.
Thank you, John. Yes, good points, particularly about local plans. Rodney, you have a technical question.
I do, don't I? Yes. Oh, there's my phone ringing at the same time. I'm going to switch it off. Hold on. Press decline. Hope it's not important. Okay, right. Number 1. This is from the MEPM community energy scheme that might one day get started. This is the radical idea department of this scheme that hasn't yet started. And question number 1 is, could 1 or even 2 axis sun tracking panels in a solar farm be financially advantageous over a static farm? Dead silence.
Looks
Who's
like-
going to
I would only have to say what the additional capital cost of a movable one versus static is, but something that can track the sun. I mean, the solar farms are, of course, usually built in the right locations, of course, and yes, whilst they are fixed and generally follow the lie of the land, there could be an advantage to having something that's movable and tracks, but that would come at additional cost, moving parts, more maintenance. I honestly don't know whether that would be financially viable or not.
mechanical engineering? Bad news. Yeah. Okay.
So from our perspective as a financing and running solar farms, it comes down on the financial side is, does the increase in yield outweigh the increase in cost? On the operations side, you've got a bunch of small motors, and it's another thing to maintain and go wrong. So there's got to be a significant benefit there. But some developers are looking at tracking panels, and east-west configurations can be useful for managing a grid constraint. If you've got a grid constraint which is mainly in the midday peak generation time, and therefore taking a slightly lower overall yield, but smoothing it out with more in the evening and morning, and lopping off that peak time load can help manage a marginal grid constraint.
Yeah, interesting answer. Yeah, I've got a second question. Could a community group have any chance of using a railway station car park for a solar farm? Panels above the cars, I mean.
Looks like Nigel's got some answers for some of these questions.
Yeah. On the tracking panels, first of all, usually they're deployed where you have very high levels of solar radiation coming in, and modules made up of cells known as triple junction cells, which are highly efficient, about double the efficiency of the stuff that we use in the UK generally. And that makes the financial model worthwhile, because they are, as Jake said, very expensive to operate. And the capex for the motors adds to the price. In terms of the station car park, solar canopy is pretty common, but once again, the business case for the infrastructure, that is the structure that holds the solar panels up above the cars, has to be factored in. And word on the community energy network is, so far no one has been able to make that business model add up at the moment for relatively small installations. But it's viable in terms of car parks at railways. Supermarkets would be another good place, even schools. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you have another? Is that all of your questions? So I've got distracted answering directly.
Yeah, I think probably 2 of that type is enough.
Okay. Does anyone else have questions? You have to wave your hands, because otherwise it looks like remarkably we might be ending early.
I've got a question for UK Power Networks. Given the rather dire state of your network in terms of capacity, what are your plans for reinforcing the East of England part of the network, which looks to the worst bit at the moment? And when can we expect to be able to have network connections that don't risk being cut off or curtailed through active network management? Thanks.
We've just put in, or not just put in, December last year, we put in our ED2 business plan, and ED2 starts in 2023, and that will be the start of our next regulatory period. And we're currently in the throes of agreeing or coming to an agreement with Ofgem over the extent of those plans and the amount of money they will allow us to spend in the next regulatory period. For now, and the challenge that we have, it's probably fair to say that most of the constraints that we are seeing are as a result of the need to reinforce the transmission network rather than ours. What that means, of course, is as soon as you start talking about transmission level reinforcement, that comes with higher complexity, higher cost, and higher lead time. So we are working with National Grid through a regional development plan for the East of England area, and most notably 3 grid supply points across sort of the mid part of the east area to try and look to get some connections earlier than the 2028 or 2030, but they are going to come with some form of constraint or curtailment. Unconstrained connections currently would be looking towards that 2028 or 2031 and the reinforcement works being completed.
Thank you.
Stuart, then Bill.
Yes, so it's just really, I mean, this in many respects, we've come away with a lot of reasons for not doing a solar farm at community level from this presentation. But I kind of felt that the bigger ones were going to be the more cost effective. So they're in the realm of the private developers for some time. And we were looking at industrial, commercial, schools and things like that as maybe more of a sweet spot for community energy. Just wondered if, Jake, you feel the same way. And also, I guess, I know there's still grid DNO issues, even connecting, a school or whatever, due to, transformers and things like that down at the lower voltages. But are we better to focus for now on finding the best roof, the biggest, with the best opportunity for a good power purchase agreement? Is that more of a sweet spot for commercial, for a community, or notwithstanding, we talked about new developments. I think that's new developments and microgrids are an opportunity too, but just your thoughts on whether industrial, commercial, schools, community buildings, that sort of thing is a better option.
From a grid perspective, probably you still need an export connection, but it may be significantly less than your generation capacity if a lot of that power is being used on site and you've got an export limiter that's controlling the flow to the grid. The challenge with establishing a community energy enterprise off rooftop solar, schools, commercial, housing, is reaching the critical mass scale you need for that enterprise to be viable. And some have done it. So Brighton Energy Co-op, for example, fantastic organisation that has built itself off rooftop solar, but it's very difficult getting to that critical mass point where you've got enough rooftop solar in your first tranche where you're generating enough surplus to cover the core running costs of the organisation, which really bare minimum of £10,000 per year. Once you've got an anchor asset or a large solar farm or a wind farm or somehow you've managed to build together a viable portfolio of rooftop solar, then it's easier to incrementally add on roofs here and there, which is what Brighton's been doing for years. So I think primarily it's a challenge of scale, and where we try to help communities do that, generally we've been unsuccessful. It's like James Land. You think you've got 100 roofs and you end up with a handful that aren't enough to make the thing viable, but economically and grid wise they work. They should work. It's a scale problem.
John Taylor, do you want to add anything to Jake's comments there?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't expecting that. Well, yeah, personally, I think with the funding situation at the moment, to be sustainable, the sector needs to be aiming for the ownership of the bigger multi-megawatt schemes. So it's obviously need to build confidence in the process. But if we can get some of those bigger projects into local ownership, maybe through some of the smaller community energy groups collaborating together at a county or regional level as a beginning, that would then help having some of that internal income within the sector rather than being reliant on the stop-start government funding as well.
Jake?
I've got a question, so I think Bill was first.
Oh, okay, all right, go on then, Bill.
Thanks. I could ask Jake to talk a little bit more about the financial risk. I'm very struck that once you're talking about a solar farm of much more than a couple of megawatts, the scale of the finance involved is disproportionate to the size of most local rural communities. I was staggered, for instance, with the recent news about the Avesco community project, which I think is 15 or 17 megawatt. Now, who is bearing the risk of these bank loans and the equity where you're talking about a relatively small parish community?
There comes small scale schemes can be funded 100% by local community investment, but I think the limit of that is quite low. And then you get to a stage where actually the bigger scheme is easier to finance because it hits a scale where commercial bank funders and social investment funds are willing to fund it. And there's a kind of a bit in the middle where it's a bit too big to fund all from local community investment, but it's too small for commercial bank finance. And the challenge for commercial bank finance is the effort and cost that goes into the transaction, all the legal fees and technical due diligence fees in getting their loan in place. So a bank like Triodos, for example, which is an ethical bank, very interested in funding community energy, they would struggle to lend at less than 5 million, and they'll typically lend 60-70% of the capital cost. So you need a project of 8 million or so before it's worthwhile for them. Who bears the risk? A bank funder will be lending directly to the project company, and they will have a security package that gives them, if something goes wrong, they have recourse to taking over the company, taking over the contracts of the company, and either managing themselves out of it, or as a last resort, selling the company. And they understand that they are, they don't have any other recourse than recourse to that company and its assets. So ultimately, the bank is taking the risk, but they will, because of that, they lend on a very conservative basis. They want everything in place, and they will lend an amount of money where the community company can afford to make the repayments under very conservative scenarios in terms of yield generation, power prices, etc.
Thank you. Ollie, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll just come up so that I make sure you can hear me. Yeah, it's just Bill, thanks for raising the Avesco example as well. And the slide that Jake gave earlier, kind of broke up the risk elements of the project, pre-construction, pre-development and things like that, kind of outline the different risk factors. And if you did a graph on that, you could see, that the finances normally finance at different risk at different stages of a project. On the Avesco solar farm, which is 17 megawatts, Avesco did really well to work with the local authority in the first place, who have developed an investment fund in renewables. So they've actually provided a development loan to Avesco to develop the project in the early stages, which they match funded with the Rural Community Energy Fund. Later on, as the project evolves, they have to start building those relationships, with industry. And that includes, bringing communities for renewables in as expert advice, but also building those relationships with the likes of Thrive Renewables or Triodos, who come in and provide investment loans at different stages during the project that align with the social impact that comes with a community energy solar farm. And then Avesco's role in this role is to look at a whole kind of district level community energy, not just parish. And I'm struck by the work that Energise South Downs have done to widen their reach. Got a lot of internal governance support so that they feel a lot stronger. And that's important. So it's not just looking at a parish solar farm. You need to build your governance out so that you get a lot stronger as a board or a community energy organisation. I think that's important. But what Avesco will do later on is that they will refinance certain elements of the scheme into community finance and pay back the investments, the low interest investments that came from the banks at different stages. So yeah, Avesco's particular mission is to offset the power of Lewis Town which is 24 megawatts. So this project is going to make a big hit on that. So that's, I was struck by John Taylor's comment earlier, you know, we can be ambitious and draw in support, and that we're a lot stronger together, sort of thing, as a sector. So yeah, don't write solar farms off. That's what I was going to say. The market will change. It normally does.
Thank you, Ollie. Jake, your question.
Oh, it's for Steve, but I'm not sure he's still here.
Oh, well, I'll give you his number later. And then over to Stuart, and then I'm going to ask our speakers who are still here. I just want to thank our speakers and ask for your final word. But Stuart, your question.
Yeah, I just wondered if anyone had any insight into whether the local energy bill is still alive or dead, or with all the turmoil going on. So I think, Jake, you might have mentioned about local energy changing, or the regulations changing in the next couple of years. Is there any more definite insight as to whether that particular bill will go through Parliament, or will it have to be another one?
Stuart, I can update on that. I saw an update this morning from the local electricity bill. I think they're slightly changing their ask. I didn't read it fully, but it is, and they've got nearly, I think they've got nearly 300 MPs behind them now.
Yeah, they seem to have a majority. Yeah.
But I just saw this morning they issued another, I think they're changing the bill slightly to take in network balancing and things like that, and curtailment. So yeah, check it.
Yeah, okay. It's all on Parliament's website, so yeah, I'll go and have a look.
So
it's not very complicated. It wasn't a very complicated bill, was it? It was really just inserting the ability for small companies to start selling.
But they do have a sensible, fairly detailed proposition behind it now, which sits behind it. And basically the principle they're asking is that a community generating its own power from renewables should be able to, via a supplier, sell that power directly to the community, and essentially fix the wholesale, the commodity element of the power, whilst paying their fair share of supply charges. Now, I think that's a fair model. It's not communities getting out of paying for system costs. It's just communities saying, if our power is coming from renewables, we want the benefit of that. And compare that to the current situation that the UK market which is completely crazy. Half our power is coming from renewable energy, but the price is set by gas. So our consumers are being pushed into poverty because of extortionate energy prices driven by gas, whilst renewable generators are making, I would say, obscene super profits, because their power price is 4, 5, 6 times what they had in their business plan, and operating costs haven't gone up. So that's all super profit. So the UK consumer is not benefiting from the fact that half our power is coming from low, stable cost, much of it subsidised renewable generation. And the government is onto that. They're looking for ways to resolve it. And I think the local electricity bill is a sensible part of that solution.
Okay, yeah, good, interesting thoughts.
Okay, Nigel, and then we're going to have to end. So
Thanks.
Yeah, go on then, Nigel.
Just want to chip in on top of that. Where you've got a existing large renewable energy installation commercially owned and generally connecting to the transmission system, because it is so big, such as offshore wind farms, particularly off the coast of East Anglia, do you think there's a case for a local electricity tariff? Because we're seeing no benefits to the fact that our natural environment, our local natural environment and resources are being exploited, and effectively the profits exported somewhere else. So shouldn't we also be pushing, in addition to that, for existing schemes, a benefit to the community derived from these lower tariffs?
Offshore wind is a bit different.
The infrastructure like this, big high transmission lines across the whole of the east.
Offshore wind is generally under something called a contract for difference. So offshore wind is or should be feeding into lower power prices.
Yeah, but that's for the whole nation. I'm talking about local benefits as a way of supporting communities, as another approach to community energy. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, in 10 years, I stood in village halls talking about community energy. The one thing everyone wants is cheap electricity. And so at the moment, the market can't do it. So it's the obvious thing that should come out of community energy, which generally doesn't yet happen.
I think this is something for us to take to Community Energy England.
Liz, where I think this is leading is that we're going to have to put a webinar on the local electricity bill and all the different mechanisms that are coming forward, because there are a lot of these mechanisms coming forward. And once again, I reference SSEN, who are just about to launch something around this as well, through their innovation. And you know, and if I could just finish off, because I've got to go on to speak at another event, but I was going to say that at the Community Energy England conference, I ran a session on capacity building, and you know, there is funding around this whole area of network capacity, you know, that comes from the DNOs through Strategic Innovation Fund. It's called STIF. Keep an eye on that, because that is where communities can partner with other partnerships and build, you know, innovation projects around connection points where maybe there isn't the capacity, but actually you could investigate capacity issues, and those projects can reach up to, you know, multiple £1 million, where you start to build, they actually reinforce. So that's called the Strategic Innovation Fund. You know, if you want to go down the innovation route and really focus big, and then so that was just a thought around that, really. The network innovation funds that come from the DNOs and the electricity networks, they love working with communities as well as other incumbents, you know, like Balfour BT, you know, and all, you know, engineering firms from the sector. So yeah.
Okay. Oh, Lynn, quickly, very quickly.
Lynn from South Harting.
From South Harting.
South Downs.
Harting can.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask if anybody had heard of any kind of connection with asking, I mean, basically, I'm listening to all of this and feeling quite bemused, but at the end of the day, we have to change our thinking as a nation, as, you know, a planet. And it would be just awful to put sticking plasters on a broken system. And has anybody heard of a way where homeowners, in this instance, our community, are asked to change in return for? So, you know, there is no question that you have to super insulate your home where you can. I mean, I live in a very precious, beautiful place on the South Downs where there are a lot of old and decrepit houses, and they're listed and etc. I know it's difficult. I'm an architect. But it just seems that we have to find ways to power down and not just keep going as we are in this kind of linear, oh, well, we'll be all right. We just spend, you know, spend the resources. I just feel kind of incensed to say that. That's all, really. So thank you.
And can I just add, not at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Got to be before the end of the day.
Please.
Ollie?
Sorry, I'm having to prepare for my next event.
Oh, okay, about powering down rather than powering up, and what has been asked of homeowners for powering down.
Yeah, well, like I said, this was a point that I was trying to make about SSEN are looking at this, and there is innovations coming out in the market about powering down and group powering down around LV substations within communities. And, you know, I think, Lynn, that whole powering down thing is something to keep a real eye on. But, you know, I've spoken to South Harting before about, you know, developing a plan for your community, and, you know, and pointing it in that direction. But there are initiatives coming through that are pointing towards the whole powering down. We've also been approached by community battery companies where you can host a community battery. And you get funded for that. And you could then share the income you get from that to households to help them power down. So, yeah.
one of the points of having a solar farm is to generate income to help your community power down. So take an example, Plymouth Energy Community in Plymouth, all the surplus income generated by their solar farms, soon to be solar farms and rooftop arrays, goes into supporting a team of energy advisors who are helping people in the city reduce their bills, in part through getting them grants to retrofit their homes with insulation and energy efficient technologies. I think we're over time now, aren't we?
We are over time, so thank you very much for participating, everyone. I was just pointing out, I haven't posted it, that you can actually download the chat box if you want to by clicking on the 3 little buttons in the chat box. So you can download and have it immediately on your computer rather than wait for me to find the time, because that can take a couple of days for me to get everything organised. So do download the chat. And thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Jake, you seem to be our only speaker left, so thank you very much for holding on beyond time while everybody else has rushed off. And I hope that although some of the information from Jake may have been sobering, I hope that we all leave better informed. And just because it's sobering doesn't mean it's not entirely possible, because what I love about community energy is the massive amounts of creativity and innovation from all the activists within this sector. So I'm hoping we will all find solutions. Thank you.